Hello and welcome to another episode of Coach and Coffee. If you do not have your coffee, go get your coffee. How are we supposed to have this conversation if you don't have coffee too? Today we're going to talk about the hardest races that I have personally done. One thing you need to remember through the course of this talk is that I've lived my entire life on a budget. Which means that money has never been something I've had a ton of extra to spend and use on whatever I wanted. Needs first, then fun. So with that in mind, I've not traveled extremely far for races. I know there are very hard races all around the world that I haven't made it to and still want to make it to, and even semi-nearby. But we're just talking about the ones that I have been able to make it to and the hardest ones. So first one that came to mind when I was thinking about this was Blue Mountain. It was the OCR World Championships in 2017, I believe. Myself, my brother, and his wife traveled up there. It was about a 10-hour drive from DC, the DC area. And we competed up there. I believe Luke did both days. Yeah, he did both days. I just did the longer one. There was a reason for it. I think it's just a money thing. I'm not sure actually why I didn't do the short one. Anyway, so that race in 2017, that was the first year I had been competitive in the sport. So before that, it was just running races, doing the best I could. But 2017 is when I started training exclusively for it, and then participating in the competitive waves. And what happened was that course, I was wearing Saucony shoes at the time, Excursions I believe, and they had good grip for normal terrain, but not for that type of terrain. Blue Mountain has multiple thousand feet of elevation gain on that course that year. I didn't have a watch with me, but trust me, it did. Everyone else said it did anyway who did have watches. And so the race started by essentially going up a hill and then down a hill and then up a ski slope, which was pretty long and steep and muddy in places. They did have a rope on that one, I believe, but it was still a challenge. And then down a very steep hill. And in 2017, I was living in the DC area. I had not had a lot of access to hills. All of the hill training I'd been doing was on an incline treadmill, which definitely helped, but I hadn't done anything like that in a competitive event, especially at the start of a race. And because it was a world championship event, I was trying to go as hard as I could right away, and so that killed me. And then after coming back around parts of the mountain, going back up those types of slopes again, and I think 2 more times, and then smaller hills included. Anyway, it was a 15K, I believe, and it felt like a 20-mile run. I can remember parts of it vividly and just thinking it seemed like it lasted forever. It was really fun. The obstacles were awesome. It's still one of my favorite races that I've ever done. They did a phenomenal job putting that on, and how professionally it was set up and everything the day before, the race day, all that stuff. But yeah, it was one of the harder ones I've ever done because I wasn't prepared to compete at that level on that type of terrain. My shoes, while good on other races I'd done, were not adequate for that. They didn't have the grip necessary to go up those hills and maintain traction without losing about a bunch of energy. Another one that I found really challenging was, I believe, the second race I ever did, which was Wintergreen, which is like 5 miles away from me right now. And I think it was my second race ever. I think I did a sprint first and then the super at Wintergreen. And that was miserable. Same type of thing. I hadn't been training. Actually, I'd been doing very little cardio work besides just short things, and interval training, which is not the same thing as anaerobic and aerobic are different. You can have one and not have the other very well. and I found that out. So, and I weighed like maybe 170 something then, high 160s maybe, so I was carrying some extra weight as well. But I hadn't, I'd not ever run up and down ski slopes like that before. And that was only a super, so it was like 8 miles, but it was horrendously difficult for me. I remember, and to put this in perspective, nowadays I can go and spend an hour and a half on wintergreen slopes, going up and down, get about 2,000 feet of elevation gain, 6, 7, usually about 7 miles in that time frame, 6.5 to 7 on the slopes, and afterwards I'm not beat, my muscles are not dead, but I spent 2 hours and 40 minutes, I believe, for the wintergreen super, and did 8 miles in 2 hours and 40 minutes, obviously obstacles in there too, but I was just so burned out at the very end. Myself, Luke did it also, this again before we were racing competitively, and then one of our other brothers did it too, and I finished first of the 3 of us, and I just sat down behind the finish line with a fit aid for about 25 minutes. I just felt awful. The last incline before the finish, right now, these days I wouldn't even call it an incline. It was just a slight slope. I felt like I couldn't even make it up that. I was like power hiking on this 5 to 7% grade. That was a very hard course. Unfortunately, they don't do races there anymore. I guess it's a logistical nightmare, and that makes sense because the drive up to it is a disaster, but that was one of the harder ones for sure, especially because of the lack of training I had for that. I completed it, and I don't know that I failed any obstacles. Maybe the spear throw? I honestly don't remember the spear throw there. I don't know if they had it. If you were there in when would that have been? 2015? No, maybe 2016, I don't know. If you remember spear throw from there, let me know in the comments, but I don't remember it. Another challenging race, Tahoe. So not last year, but the year before. I think that's right, yeah. 2018, I went to Tahoe. I qualified for the World Championship in the Elite Wave, and I'd never done any training or running at elevation before, and I'm still not sure to date if it played a factor. What I do know is at the end of the race I was coughing a lot, and my lungs felt exhausted, so it may have been a factor, but the course was just intense. I never, like I said, never done any races at elevation like that. I'd never been on the West Coast doing races. I'd never flown to a race and then raced, and I flew in less than 24 hours before, had to drive to my hotel, had to drive an hour in the morning to get to the race, so I wasn't well rested for it, but it was a really fun experience. They upgraded me to a truck from a car, and that was fun. I have a car all the time, so driving a truck was a great change up. But that course is really tough. The cold made it much harder because of the swim at the top where the water was cold. I didn't bring any cold gear for it because I figured I could just run through it, and I was able to, but the cold at the very top was quite miserable. And then the last climb, and that may have been where I felt the elevation most. I was just dying on the last climb, and I made a really boneheaded mistake on the Z wall and tried to rush it for no reason at the very last second, right before the bell, and just slipped right off and had to do my burpees, which really messed up my time and my finishing. So that was a really tough one. I was just not my mind was exhausted at that point in the race, so I made a dumb mistake and then made it even harder on myself. That was a really tough one. I'm trying to think of other tough ones around here. A lot of courses, so the North Carolina Ultra last year, 2019, was hard, but that was weather conditions. It wasn't a tough It wasn't a tough course at all. Besides it being muddy on the second lap after everyone shredded the course, it was like the first lap was flying. It was a very easy course, I would say. They said it had like multiple thousands of feet of elevation gain, and it was half of what they said it was. It was not bad at all. I'm not really sure what the toughest course I ever did was. I guess it would be, it's not a real fair comparison, honestly, because if I were to say, as far as like feeling the worst after a race, it was more than very likely at Wintergreen, but I hadn't done any type of training even remotely like that ever, or done anything like that ever before. So comparing that to maybe like a Tahoe or the 2017 World Championship in Ontario, not really fair comparisons. As far as since I've been training specifically for OCR and I've built up a really strong base and foundation, man, I guess Tahoe. There's so many like really tough races out there that I want to do. Killington, I've not made it to. It's like almost a 10-hour drive for me, and until this year they were just hosting normal races there, so it wasn't worth the money to drive that far. They were supposed to do the Ultra World Championship there, so I was planning on doing that this year, but obviously it didn't happen, or isn't happening, and I assume that would have been the hardest. Yeah, man, there's courses out in the Midwest, like Big Bear, well, I think that's California, but in the Midwest on mountains that I really want to do because I love the mountain running, that I'm sure would be harder than some of the ones I've done so far. But I guess overall, as far as just like feeling the worst, it would be Wintergreen at the end of the race, feeling the worst. And then as far as like the actually most challenging would probably have to be Tahoe, only because of, I guess, the distance, the cold, the climbs, the whole mix of everything, and then the final downhill for it. You had the opportunity potentially to make up a lot of time and ground because of how long that final downhill was, but it was also very technical. At least I thought it was very technical, and so it would have been extremely challenging to go really fast on it. And when you're fatigued, running super fast downhill is not what your brain wants to do, and it takes a lot of work to actually try and do that. So I'd say that was probably overall the hardest since I've actually been competing. There have been some hard courses I've done otherwise that didn't include a lot of elevation, but it's almost always the ones with lots of elevation that are going to be the hardest, physically and mentally, just grinding through it all. Let me know what the hardest course you've ever done is and why. Put it in the comments below. Let's see who's got the most miserable experience. It's not a competition per se, but it's just fun to hear. Post those down below, and I will catch you next time on Coach and Coffee.